Welcome to the Seven Mountains Podcast, an ongoing series of conversations about the Seven Mountains Mandate, the plan to Christianize America and destroy democracy. The Christian Nationalism Mandate is the subject of my new book, published by Westminster John Knox Press, available for pre-order now. The link to buy and a discount code will be in the show notes. Today's guests are a couple of, well, say historians, but one's a classicist, so kind of like that. But they're also a married couple in Ohio. So please introduce yourself.
I'm Daniel Williams. I have been teaching American history for the past 20 years at a couple of different institutions. I was at the University of West Georgia for quite some time. Now I'm at Ashland University, and I'm the author of several books on the history of American religion and politics, including The Politics of the Cross, God's Own Party, and a couple of others.
And his
I'm
lovely wife.
Nadya. Oh, sorry. I'm Nadya. I'm married to Dan, obviously, and I taught with Dan at the University of West Georgia for 13 years, a total of 15 years in academia. And when things started looking really awful, I walked away. And so now I'm a homeschool mom, editor, and writer.
Well, thanks for coming. I hope everybody enjoys this conversation. I wanted this conversation to focus on the Seven Mountains, the Mountain of Family, which is the Christian Nationalism Project to enforce the traditional nuclear family on America. And I wanted both of you, because you're married and you have a family and you have some lovely children, but also you are great writers about issues that deal with family. So I wanted to start out with a question for both of you is, let's see here, what would be the best way to say it? Why is there such an interest by Christians and non-Christians in marriage?
I think it's a good interest at its heart. So I'm a big fan of Brad Wilcox's work, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So his book, Get Married. The statistics are clear. People who are married are happier, wealthier, healthier, by the way, like the health benefits, especially for men. Men who are married in happy marriages live longer.
Yeah.
Did you know that? It's pretty cool. Anyway, so there are really good things, but at the same time, I think both Dan and I have written about this. As Christians, we also need to keep in mind not to make good things of this world the ultimate things, and that's kind of my big concern with anything in our lives that is good. It is a good thing. We should love each other, which we do, and we enjoy our marriage. We enjoy our kids, but are they the ultimate things in life? And I would say no.
And why, as a historian, and why do you think people are interested in marriage?
Yeah, well, I think that Christianity is fundamentally about a relationship. If we look at it theologically, it's about a relationship with God. And so the closest, most intimate relationship that we can have on earth is marriage. And the parallel between the relationship with God and the relationship between husband and wife actually predates Christianity. It goes all the way back to the Hebrew Bible, with books like Hosea, for example, and then it's carried over into the New Testament with parallels between the relationship between Christ and the church and husband and wife in books like Ephesians. And so Christianity has always picked up on that. In the Reformation era, the Protestants were famous for centralizing marriage by allowing and encouraging marriage for everyone, including the clergy. The Catholics, I think, responded by, while not getting rid of the celibacy mandate for clergy, making exhortations on marriage more central. And I think in the 20th century, that became even more prominent in the Catholic Church, so that since Vatican II, married couples have often taken the lead in Catholic teaching on marriage in a way that maybe was not necessarily true historically in Catholicism. And meanwhile, American Protestants, especially evangelical Protestants, have viewed themselves as defenders of marriage and defenders of the family to a greater degree in the late 20th century than one could see at any other point, though that itself is not completely new. If you go back to the evangelical campaigns of the late 19th and early 20th century, you could think about temperance, you could think about other campaigns that were family-centered or that could be framed as family-centered. So much of the fundamentalist movement's rhetoric of the 1920s on issues of gender and marriage and sexuality really parallels or is a good prequel to what we would see in the late 20th century. But the political movement that we're most familiar with in evangelicalism in the late 20th century with the rise of the Christian right was, from the very beginning in the 1970s, a movement that framed itself as a way to save marriage and the family. And there's pretty good statistical data that people who are married with children are more likely to be in church than those who are not. And as a result, a lot of modern evangelical culture has been framed around the suburban family-friendly churches. I think there are obviously evangelical churches that have tried to move away from that have tried to reach singles, that have tried to become urban church plants. But even today, I think that centrality, that emphasis on marriage is not far removed from the center of evangelical culture.
Dan, you write in the Politics of the Cross, basically summarizing what you both just said, but then you add a line about the ways in which evangelicals since the 70s have tried to, empower marriage and the roles of marriage, and said, but very little of this can be translated into civil law. As you know, Christian nationalism is a movement of civil law. And this is for both of you. I just want to get a sense of you living in Ohio. Do you see a lot of attempts to put into civil law the things you support in marriage in Ohio? Or is Christian nationalism doing that in Ohio? How does Ohio work in that?
Yes. I think Ohio is not technically part of the Bible Belt, but it is shaped by a Midwestern rural culture that has historically been evangelical and parallels the Bible Belt to some degree. So in the late 19th century and early 20th century, this region of northeastern and central Ohio that we're a part of was shaped very much by Methodism, by the Methodist revivals of the mid-19th century. And that has carried forward in a way, even though a lot of the Methodist churches have declined in membership, it has left a lasting impact on the culture. And so this region of Ohio was very strongly supportive of the temperance movement in the early 20th century, very strongly supportive of prohibition, and shaped, I would say, by the continuing waves of evangelical political movements right through the end of the 20th century and beyond. So while today Ohio is somewhat less churched than Georgia, there are pockets of Ohio that are still very much shaped by a church culture that has moved from historic conservative mainline Protestantism. So the Methodist churches in Ohio perhaps would have identified as mainline Protestant, but would have been also influenced by a general social conservatism of the region, has shifted from that toward, in very recent years, maybe a more overt Christian nationalism.
There are some large megachurches in Ohio.
Yes, there are. However, at the polls, I would say Ohio's political culture is defined less by strong Christian political victories in the way that we might see in states that have higher church attendance rates like Alabama or Mississippi, and more by a generic conservatism that is less churched, more populist. So even as Ohio has become more strongly supportive of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, even as statewide races are now won exclusively by Republicans. We have now 2 Republican senators and Republican state government. It is a thoroughly Republican state. But even as that has taken place, we've seen the Christian rights causes lose at the polls. So when Ohio had an abortion referendum in 2022, or 2023 rather, the restrictive abortion law that had been in place for a very short time in Ohio was overturned by the voters. And the same thing was true with marijuana. Marijuana is now legal in Ohio. So I would say that the Christian right is a player in Ohio politics, but it's not necessarily the dominant player in Ohio's version of conservatism.
So Nadya, with that big overview, do you get in a lot of discussions with homeschool moms about Christian nationalism?
We don't actually talk about Christian nationalism, but we do talk about such things like the concern about marijuana laws.
Okay.
And we're really glad that our particular town has managed in somehow, I'm not entirely sure how, to keep out the shops out of prominence.
Right. Yeah.
But it's really sleazy. Like, you drive over the state line into Michigan and suddenly it's like that's all you see on the billboards. That's like disconcerting. And whether you're like, whatever your political views, like as a parent, that is disconcerting.
Okay. I would question about the homeschool. You mentioned that you left academia to be at homeschool. Was the homeschool choice for both of you, I guess, I want to say for the children because it would be better for them, or was it because of many reasons? I guess why did you choose homeschool?
We've always homeschooled, even when we were
in
academia.
Okay.
Yeah. And actually, many of our colleagues in the University of West Georgia were homeschooling their children. So I think there's quite a gamut. I think there's a mistaken assumption sometimes that homeschoolers are political, but North Georgia for a while had a Wiccan homeschool co-op.
Wow.
So I don't know if it still exists, Matthew, but it was there a few years ago, and a colleague was telling me about it. So there are all kinds of homeschool pockets. It doesn't necessarily mean ultra conservative, whatever else. Now, for us, it is a matter of how do we live together as a family.
Okay.
Kids are only kids for a very short time. We feel like we have been given this treasure, this responsibility to steward our children. By the way, Dan was homeschooled, and I think he turned out pretty well. So there's that testimony of, from the educational perspective, that's good, but also just from the family culture perspective, we want to have a close relationship with our children. We want our family to be close knit. And we worry about losing those connections when children are little, sending them away for more hours in the day than we get to spend with them. Just didn't feel good.
Okay. So Dan, with the book that I'm writing, the Seven Mountains Mandate and the Mountain of Family, they want to, I would say, impose through legal or cultural means the idea of complementarianism. You've written about that a little bit in your history books, how that developed. I guess my question to you is, can you give me a short definition of that, and where do you see that? Is it rising or falling at the moment in terms of conservative politics?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I would define complementarianism, just broadly speaking, as the belief that men and women were created differently, with distinct but complementary roles. Now, under that rubric can fall quite a number of things, as you probably know. This term, I think, goes back to the end of the 1980s. The ideas, of course, are much older. I think that in the 1950s, the way that I've defined complementarianism would have been accepted by a wide number of people, not necessarily in evangelical circles. So the idea that there were distinct differences between men and women that were not necessarily to be erased was something that actually was very much part of mainstream psychology in the 1950s. And then in the early 1960s, with the second wave feminist movement, there was an effort to try to push back against that notion, with some valid reason for doing so. I think Betty Friedan and a number of others sensed correctly that some of this psychological language about male and female differences was being used to prevent women from achieving their full potential in certain vast areas of society, career fields, politics, etc. But part of what second wave feminism did was to try to argue that really there were no meaningful essential differences between men and women, that whatever differences there were somewhat trivial and far less significant than the similarities. And there were second wave feminists who differed from that. There was a minority wing of second wave feminism that could be called the feminism of difference or difference feminism. But if we're looking at, say, the mainstream wing associated with the National Organization for Women and most of the leaders associated with that, there was very much an emphasis on equality in the late 1960s and 1970s. Most conservative evangelicals pushed back against that in the early 1970s. And so that's where you would start to get the literature that today people would call complementarian. Actually, in the early 1960s, if you would look at mainstream evangelical magazines at the time, like Christian Life and others, even Christianity Today, when they would publish articles on women's roles, they were not necessarily egalitarian by modern standards, but actually pushing against what today might be called the more hyper complementarianism of a larger culture, saying that maybe women didn't need to focus so heavily on getting married when they were 18 or 19. Maybe some women were called to the mission field, other things of that nature, where we actually might be surprised where the lines will be drawn. But starting in the 1970s, one of the markers of conservative evangelical culture was this emphasis on gender distinctions, first in the home and then in the church. And in the last 40 years, I think that has been polarizing within evangelicalism, where I would say that academic evangelicalism has been affected disproportionately by a fairly strong gender egalitarianism. And so if you look at major...
What would be academic evangelicalism to you?
Wheaton College, Fuller Theological Seminary. I doubt you could get hired at Fuller Theological Seminary as a complementarian.
Right.
Wheaton College is more amenable to hiring both complementarians and egalitarians, but I would say for the past decade or two, egalitarians have probably had more influence than complementarians in significant pockets of Wheaton College, including their Bible department. And so for some of those academic evangelicals, the full equality of men and women in the church is a matter of principle, of ethics and theology, that they would say Jesus reached out to women, which is true, and that the church was an egalitarian institution, and that the complementarianism is a later import after, perhaps certainly after the original generation of the apostles, after the first century, and that we need to return the church to the egalitarian spirit of Jesus. Sometimes that's associated with a general progressive politics. Sometimes it's not. Pentecostalism, for example, has long been mostly gender egalitarian from the very beginning, though that is beginning to change. But I think that if you go back to the early 20th century and you think about itinerant Pentecostal evangelists like Amy Semple McPherson, there were people who were women in ministry who were very prominent in Pentecostal circles, and that was not necessarily associated with progressive politics. But there's also a connection today where it's pretty rare, I think, to find a politically progressive evangelical denomination that would not also be strongly egalitarian. But today, within evangelical complementarian circles, which are still the majority of evangelical denominations or even non-denominational churches in this country, that complementarianism is not universal among evangelicals, but it is a dominant influence, especially outside of academic evangelicalism. I think there's a spectrum there, and one can move from what I would call what's sometimes been called kind of a soft complementarianism, where people recognize there are gender distinctions and that there's a belief that perhaps senior pastoral leadership should be reserved for men, but that women's voices should be encouraged. Women's ministries are very important, and that there's an emphasis on, if there's less of an emphasis on female submission than there is on a mutual submission and a selflessness that should characterize male servant leadership in imitation of Christ. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end, at the far end, would be a very strong patriarchal notion that men need to take the rule, and sometimes in Calvinist circles that's associated with a particular type of federal headship theology. This would be similar to what Doug Wilson has emphasized in hyper conservative reform circles, but the idea that men represent women before God and in society, and that women need to be covered by this umbrella of male federal headship. And then one can find a number of positions in between. So I think 30 years ago, when people talked about complementarianism, they tended to think they knew what they were talking about, that it was one thing. And today, I think it's not one thing. It's a wide variety of things that could be labeled complementarianism.
As someone who, let's say, grew up evangelical, but certainly became a Christian during that time of the 90s and the 2000s, I never heard the term complementarianism, but I always heard the things around it. The isms came later. And so writing this chapter on the Mountain of Family, I got to go back and look at John Eldredge's books that I read as a young man, but also contrasted that with, as you mentioned, Betty Friedan, and how really those two type of things still impact gender and family in the evangelical world. As you laid out, the spectrum, specifically the male leadership spectrum, that is something that Charlie Kirk and Turning Point promote a lot. At the same time, they host young women leadership summits, and they don't put leadership in their male summits, but they also imply that they are the leaders. Nada, you wrote a book about motherhood and ancient Christians. And I wanted to ask, because I read through the index looking for the word Christian nationalism, how does Christian nationalism relate to that book?
It doesn't.
Oh, okay.
Like, that was not in my, like, that did not come to my mind at all when writing that book. I was focused much more on just the general cultural attitude today, where we are repaganizing the attitudes, the utilitarian attitudes towards mothers and children and human life resemble pre-Christian pagans much more than what Jesus was teaching, is kind of in a nutshell. So my concern was that the cultural pagan kind of utilitarian view of life, like, what are you bringing to the GDP? And if you're not bringing anything to the GDP, you don't matter. That attitude was something that I really wanted to confront, because it is seeping into church. There is a lot of just kind of like, are you useful to society? Well, I do want to say what Dan was talking about, kind of the spectrum of complementarianism, because we've always been in complementarian churches. I've been a Christian now for close to 14 years, and the entire time I've been in complementarian churches. And if they're healthy complementarian churches, it is a delight to be a woman in those circles. Like, I've always felt supported. And in fact, the negative kind of interactions that I've had whenever I felt disrespected in academic circles, in evangelicalism, it's always come from egalitarians. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Well, you mentioned academic evangelicals, and I thought you were talking about evangelicals who are in academia or who are writing great books outside of academia. But I did want to ask that question for both of you. Like, being, we'll say academics, evangelicals, do you find that um, impacts your family in strong ways? Or I guess my question is, as you study these things, both of you, do you find that stays in the office, or does it creep into the house? I think we lost Nadya there for a minute, but
Yeah, I think that we certainly talk about our ideas, and so I think that there is a blurring of the lines. Certainly, a lot of Nadia's work is very personal. So her own writing, I think, reflects her personal story, perhaps to a greater degree, significantly greater degree than I would say is true for my writing, which tends to be a little bit more academic and analytical rather than necessarily personal. I would say that my own study of history and theology has certainly affected the way that I live, the way that I think about my home. I would say that had I not gone into academia and had I not done the sort of reading that I've done over the years, perhaps my theological journey would have been significantly shortchanged, that I would not have had the range of voices to consider, that I perhaps would not have made some of the changes in my own thinking that I have. So whenever I embark on a research topic, I have some personal interest in that field and in that particular topic, and so it affects the way that I think about the world, the way that and therefore the way that I interact at home as well as elsewhere. And I think both of us have benefited from talking to the other person about our ideas. We've certainly written works that are parallel, even if they're coming at these questions from a different framework. And being both academically minded people, it's not too surprising we have academically minded kids, especially our 9-year-old son Jonah is very interested in talking about issues of history, issues of politics, and so I think there is a lot of cross-pollination. I think that we, even though academia is a somewhat separate sphere from the home, there's a great deal of overlap in how we think in each sphere of our lives.
question was, how does your academic work affect your home life? I wanted to rephrase it for you. I guess specifically, do you allow Dan to read your stuff before it's published, or is it he has to read it when it's finally done? Because my wife asked, when can I read the book that's coming out? I said, well, you can read it when it comes out in September. That is, I didn't want her to read it until it was finally out. Do you guys do early drafts between each other, or do you have him read it when it's finally published?
You remember that news story that broke about the Christian nationalist pastor who does not allow his wife to read anything until he reads it first?
There you go.
A lot of times it's not a formal structure, but a lot of times I read books before Dan does, and then I tell him, you need to read this.
Right. Okay.
I love reading. I'm a fast reader.
Okay.
I'm a very fast writer, and I'm also an editor. So whenever Dan writes for Current, for instance, I'm the one who edits his essays. So in that case, I not only read it, but also like go through and edit carefully and tell him like, okay, I'm cutting this or I'm rephrasing this. So it's a whole another relationship, I think, in an academic, intellectually engaged marriage. I still think there's a beauty there, the complementarity, that we really do think differently. Dan is a much more kind of cerebral, and I wouldn't say that I'm not cerebral, but I'm a lot more emotional in how I approach everything, and which is fine. Like we people, like most of us, have pretty deep feelings, and we express that in our writing and how we process the world. The historian like myth of objectivity is something that keeps getting debunked. It's we'd like to pretend that everything we write is perfectly scientific, but the reality is the study of people is not as scientific as you think, because we are not like lab rats.
Right. Yeah. I'd heard the story when Jimmy Carter died, that he and his wife had written a book together, and it was the thing that almost destroyed their marriage. that they like emailed each other different corrections. I'm sure they were sitting in the same house, right? But they had to go back and forth, and I think they obviously finished it, but he said it was one of their most trying times. So I'll just go ahead and throw it out there. You guys have any plans to write books together or
The
articles?
funny thing is, I had just had a conversation with an editor a few days ago about a book that I'm writing with his press, and he said, like, have you and Dan considered writing something together? And my answer was no. We just have a very different approach. We benefit from reading each other's work. I especially benefit from reading Dan's work because he does this sort of like really deep research that I don't do.
Right.
And it's really just so helpful for me to kind of get the facts before I kind of go off and try to fit it into the bigger picture that I'm interested in. But I think it would be just our personalities are so different. Obviously, you can never say no forever, but not anytime soon.
Okay. Well, obviously you guys have a happy marriage, but not so much. I wouldn't try to write together. That'd be totally different. So I'm asking everybody this question, because of what my book is about, the Seven Mountains Mandate. So both of you are welcome to answer, but when was the first time you heard the phrase, the Seven Mountains Mandate?
I think it was actually your work that brought it to my attention when you sent me an early proposal. I had not really followed that extensively, and maybe I should have, but I will say that even though I write on the Christian right, I think after 2010, when I published God's Own Party, my own primary research areas, while still including some aspects of evangelical politics for a while, moved into really focusing on the Catholic dominated pro-life movement of the early 1970s, and then after that I was researching some other things. So
You got away from it, yeah.
I was looking at the Christian right from perhaps greater distance than I did when I was actually writing God's Own Party. And one of the things that in particular that I missed for a while was the transformation of charismatic Christianity, because my own background is not charismatic at all. I've never been part of a charismatic church. I've not really worked in those circles. You were talking about academic evangelicalism. Both Nadya and I are now very active in Christian historical associations and other things that bring us into contact with Christian colleges. But those circles are almost entirely devoid of the sort of charismatics who have been so pivotal in the modern cultural turn to the right in certain wings of evangelicalism. So I'm very conversant in a lot of the things that take place in Reformed circles, or that have taken place in Reformed circles in the 2010s and early 2020s. But when I'm getting news on what's happening in charismatic Christianity, it's coming from the same secondary sources that most people are getting their news from, because I just don't talk to people who are in those circles as deeply as you would need to be to pick up on some of these theological trends. However, after what you wrote and talking then to some other academics who were studying this and doing some of my own reading, I have realized how much of the Christian right story of the 2010s is a story of what was going on in charismatic churches that were picking up, I think, where Francis Schaeffer left off. In other words, they were drawing from Reformed influences, oftentimes without even fully being aware of the strongly Reformed worldview theology that was being imported into charismatic circles. And I found that to be very fascinating. I still find it to be really fascinating. I've not written on it myself, but I think that if one is going to write on the 21st century Christian right or Christian nationalism, that's probably going to be the most central part of the story.
Yeah. So Nadya, when did you hear the term first?
I think John Fia's blog,
Okay.
because he does include he's pretty expansive in his coverage of evangelical trends and news, and so he has been covering those kinds of stories. It's been fascinating and kind of like watching something that you think like, I mean, I'm an evangelical, like that's what I've always been in my Christian walk, and
Mhm.
yet realizing like this is a very different sort of evangelical, almost like looking at a foreign country. Quite bizarre.
Yeah. And so I had known it before Trump came to office. I'd heard the phrase. It's associated with theonomy, and Christian nationalism is not obviously an old term, pretty newish, but nonetheless, I guess what I'm getting at is that this idea that there are seven areas of cultural influence that you want to take over, but also that are already have been taken over by Satan or by a demon, or that there's a demon atop of the mountain that you have to knock off, and that's how you take over the mountain. And that's why the metaphor of the mountain is first come in the around 2000, but it dates back to Bill Bright and the Campus Crusade movement. He wrote a book in 1986, I get the right, about 9 areas of cultural influence. And I wanted to bring up Bill Bright because both of you have experience on college campuses and things like that. And I was wondering if you, in your own personal Christian journey, how linked you were to campus ministries, and what were they, if there were any?
Uh, when I was in grad school, I was part of an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship chapter for grad students. As an undergrad, I was um, I was not part of a campus ministry at that point, but I was in close association with people who were part of what was called Campus Bible Fellowship, which was much more conservative Baptist. Um, Campus Crusade was, as it was called then, was something that didn't have a particularly large presence at the college that I attended. I had a larger presence at the University of Maine, which I did not attend, but I knew people at the University of Maine, including a couple that I still friends with who actually met at Campus Crusade. So,
Okay.
I was very familiar with Campus Crusade, and in my own research on the Christian right, I've read about Bill Bright quite a bit. He played some role in my book, God's Own Party. Each of these Christian ministries, I think, has a very different emphasis, or at least different accent, we could say, even though they are parallel and would ultimately say they have the same purpose. But InterVarsity, at the time that I was involved in it, was viewed as much more cerebral, reflective, not interested as much in a cultural in a cultural engagement or cultural takeover, and much more interested in reflection on whether we needed to change as evangelicals. So the sort of things that the InterVarsity leaders were talking about at the time were books essentially urging repentance for white supremacy and that sort of thing. It was not. It was a far cry from what you're describing with Bill Bright's emphasis. But I mean, Campus Crusade was always an evangelistic organization.
Right.
It was not too surprising that while evangelism remained central, the parallel track of cultural engagement and saving the nation, which I think energized Bill Bright from the mid 1970s on, would have been one piece of that.
What was your campus experience with ministries?
I came to Christ at age 30, so like long after college and graduate school. But we attended a church when we were working at West Georgia. We attended a church that had a wonderful chapter of CO, campus outreach.
Yeah.
And again, it was very much focused on individual salvation, coming to Christ. Like, what does it mean to be a Christian? There was no real like cultural component there. It was a lot more like looking at college students who increasingly, as we all have seen over the last decades, become kind of unmoored from like any sort of meaning. And post-COVID, it seemed even worse. Like, how do you live a healthy life? Even like the guys who would not live leave their dorm rooms and would just like skip classes and play video games all day. Like, how do you reach people like that and explain, like, here's how you can be a functional adult? And by the way, having a relationship with Jesus would be a great part of being a functional adult. But it's just like a lot of that intervention, the sort of thing that good student support staff would be doing in a secular level, but seeing a lot of that being done through campus ministries. That was encouraging.
As a non-Christian on a college campus, do you remember interacting with such ministries, or how did they come across to you?
I had no interactions. I was at the University of Virginia, which
Wow.
does have like
Yeah.
great fellowships, but I think it's a reminder of silos. Unless you look for something or have close friends who are in something, you're not necessarily going to come across it. I had zero awareness of any of that.
Well, I went to the University of Florida as an undergrad, and the guys with the big crosses came out every beginning of the semester. There were obviously a boatload of Christian ministries. Campus Crusade was one of them. And they were all over the place. So you could not, they did large marketing media campaigns, if you will. And so you could not get away from them. Not that I wanted to get away from them. I'm just saying they were everywhere, and they were a presence, and maybe because it was Florida, it was in the South, but nonetheless, they were there. I bring that up because how that translates into the mountain of family. I wanted to ask both of you, like, how do you see your children doing in college, or how do you think they'll be impacted by how college is different today, or what do you fear about them going to college?
I would not send my children to a state school right now. Like, I know this is sort of like throwing a flaming grenade into the room, proverbial room, but I think I would want to send my children to a small, like truly mission-minded Christian college where they would learn how to serve Jesus.
Mm-hmm. I think every kid is different and is going to have different needs as they grow up. When I came of age in a conservative Christian home where I was homeschooled, I was very eager to go to a secular campus and did. It was a private research university, Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. And I've seen Christians who've really thrived, who've made the faith their own at secular campuses, particularly if they're plugged into a church or if they're plugged into a campus ministry. I think there's one thing that even in the best situations, though, tends to be missing from those scenarios, and that would be faculty mentoring involving a faith perspective. There are a handful, of course, of faculty who might have strong faith commitments that someone might run into at secular schools, and I applaud those faculty. And of course, Nadya and I were once part of that as well, and tried to have meaningful conversations with students who sometimes sought us out to ask about questions of personal relevance for their faith lives. I think that's a valuable service that Christian faculty can perform on a secular college campus. But systematically, there's certainly not a worldview formation or a systematic help in dealing with some of the challenges of life as they pertain to faith. And that is something that Christian colleges at their best can offer. Obviously, one disadvantage of a Christian college for many people is the perception of hypocrisy, the feeling like maybe this wasn't the utopia that people imagined it. And so a Christian college has its own pitfalls. It's not going to be a panacea. And I've certainly known very faithful Christians, including, interestingly enough, the pastor of our former church, who was a University of Florida grad. He transferred from Covenant College to University of Florida, was very active in Campus Crusade, and felt like it just gave him the impetus for ministry that he would have never gotten had he just stayed at Covenant. So, each person has their own journey, and sometimes it's difficult for parents to guess, what that journey is going to be or what they need. I would say that as we look at Jonah in particular, he's a very intellectually engaged person, and he's actually sitting in on some of my college classes. He really enjoys reading the primary source documents, discussing them, and we have some great conversations. And I would hope that we could find a place for him where he could continue to thrive intellectually, where he could feel like his mind is being challenged, and yet a place where he could develop holistically, including.
And how old is he right now?
He's 9.5. He'll be 10 in June. But he is, he's very, very much an intellectually minded person. And obviously not everybody is. There are a lot of different needs. And Christian colleges are also not one size fits all either. There's a very wide spectrum of Christian colleges. And I think that the challenge for every parent is to try to figure out, okay, how do you find the right match for your kid, given some of these unique aspects of each person's personality.
So I wanted to end here within the hour, but I wanted to end on a question, that has to do with family. And I guess sort of for me, it is like I have my family, my 2 children and my wife, and we're great. And we talk about the things that are happening at the national level, but we also feel disconnected from the local level for many reasons. There was COVID and we have other things that we going on. I guess what my question to both of you is like, do you feel that you are part of something that is making a difference nationally? Do you see cultural change happening through your family or your church or your local interests, or do you see yourself at distance from that? I'm more connected to national stuff than local stuff, and I was just wondering if you see that working out in your life.
Well, as someone who writes for Front Porch Republic, I'd say it's localism all the way.
Right.
I don't know like how I would even be able to tell if I made a difference at something nationally.
Okay.
And so it's a lot like more productive for me anyway at this stage to focus on the local. Like we have friends, we have families who like it's that test. If you had an emergency at 2 a.m., do you have someone nearby that you could call who would come to your house in 10 minutes and watch your children while you go to the emergency room or something like that? And we have a lot of those people, both at our church and just local like friends. And it is such a delight. Like you have to have that community of people you live with. And so for us, it's been such a joy to find those people. And most of them are just families, either at our stage of life with small children, or people who have raised kids but have like-minded a love for Christ, a love for this community. A lot of them have lived here their whole lives, so it's been beautiful.
Dan, where would you rate yourself in national versus local?
Yeah, well, certainly with my books and public writing articles, I have tried to influence the national political conversation, less so with a particular lobbying agenda than with simply a desire for people to think through issues from a more critical perspective and to come to a deeper understanding of people on different sides of matters of political controversy, and also to separate the Christian faith principles from the non-negotiables from perhaps a particular application of political theology in a partisan direction. And whether my work has been particularly influential or not, it's hard to say, because I think that while you could measure your influence in terms of number of podcasts or number of people who come to you at a conference and say, oh, thank you for writing this book, it prompted me to think about things in a very helpful direction. What I've also realized is that any book, whether it's a bestseller or whether it's bought by 200 people, it is going to primarily appeal to people who are sympathetic toward that point of view. And so if you're getting a lot of people saying, this is exactly what's needed, you're probably talking to people who already believe most of those things, and that your book was just kind of the final piece of the puzzle that helps them put it all together. Or if they do change their mind, which has happened on very rare occasions for me, where I've had people come up to me and say, I really do think about things differently as a result of reading your book. Chances are overwhelming. It's just like any conversion of any type. There wasn't just one person who was making the difference, who was bringing ideas to the table. So I think that I'm part of a larger group of people who are taking Christian faith very seriously and are trying to separate that from particular political platforms, and who are saying that Christianity should affect the way that we think about everything, including politics. But it's not as simple a matter as saying we need to take back our country. And I think some people in that camp who have far more influence than I do are people like Russell Moore, or before he died, Tim Keller. Both of those people have been very influential in my own faith journey and my own way of thinking about the world. And if at some level I can add to the conversation, perhaps, especially through my own academic research, uncovering some archival sources or uncovering some historical insights that maybe are not as much a part of the conversation, if I can add those to the conversation, I think that would be helpful. But generally speaking, people who have the illusion of changing the country or changing the world are often people that are going to be disappointed and frustrated at when they finally realize their own limited influence, because all of us are finite creatures, and we're just people in God's kingdom. God is using us in particular ways, but if we're seeking a national stage, if we're seeking to be particularly influential, we're probably going to be disappointed. On the other hand, if we say, okay, what good can I do in the sphere that I'm in, then we'll probably find a lot of reason for gratitude.
Very nice words. Thank you so much for joining me on the inaugural episode of the Seven Mountains podcast. You guys are great people, and I hope that you will continue on doing what it is you're doing, all that you're doing, and impacting people. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you.